All right, labor class, chapter 14, part 2. Time to bring back another baseball hat. Obviously, this represents the Chicago White Sox. I did have the opportunity in Chicago to go see the White Sox play in 2005, which is the only year in the last 100 that they won the World Series. So we got lucky. Okay, back to work. So we're talking about unemployment, various concepts, and so let's continue our discussion and look at the way we examine unemployment and the way that we can model job search. Okay, the first thing is to remember that unemployment is a stock measure. It's a measure at a point in time. But changes in the unemployment rate refer to flows of people in and out of the state of employment, okay? Stock and flow measures are common in economics. The distinction between income and wealth is a perfect example of that. Income is an amount that you earn at over a given period of time. Wealth is something that is accumulated over time. Okay, so we want to look at the flows in and out to identify the sources of changes in the unemployment rate. Are they changing because people are exiting the workforce? Is it changing because people have become optimistic? Not currently, but recently, optimistic and more people are entering the workforce, whatever the circumstance might be. So we've got a way to show that. And this is actually a diagram that you can find on page 563 of the book, but I want to talk about it in some depth. So that's why I'm reproducing it for you here. Okay. So a couple things. Remember, the unemployment rate is based on those number who are out of work divided by the number who are out of work plus the number who are employed. Okay. And that is how we've always calculated the basic unemployment rate. There are three states of where an individual can be. They can be employed, they can be unemployed, or not in the labor force at all. And remembering, we're only measuring those over the age of 16 in terms of determining whether they're in the labor force or not. Okay, so the way we can look at this is look at unemployment as a functional relationship of P here, which is the fraction of individuals who change their state in the labor force. And with three different possibilities, and it's always going to move from one state to a second state, 3 times 2 gives us 6 different factors that influence the unemployment rate. And with the pluses and minuses that we have above, and we're going to have half of each, we are looking at what happens to the unemployment rate when there's an increase in the proportion who go from one state to another. Okay, so for example, let's just go down the list. The first is P sub En. So this is the proportion who simply leave the labor force and they go from a state of employment maybe to like a state of retirement, okay? And when that happens, the unemployment rate is going to go up. That should be rather obvious because the denominator is getting smaller. The unemployment rate is going to go and get bigger. Okay. The second example, which is PNE, it's simply the opposite situation. This is where people go from not being in the workforce at all to a state of employment. Usually along the way, there may be some unemployment, but literally, if you're in school and you have a job offer waiting for you when you graduate, that would be P sub NE. So again, it goes from the first state in the subscript to the second state in the subscript. And obviously, if you go from not in the labor force at all to being employed, then the denominator is getting bigger, so the unemployment rate is going down. Okay. The third case is a PUN, and this is where you go from a state of unemployment to not in the labor force. This would be the discouraged worker as sort of the obvious example. And when that happens, the numerator and the denominator going down, but overall the unemployment rate is going to get lower. You can do a numerical example to prove it yourself, or take the derivative of this with respect to a change in U, and you'll see that the unemployment rate go down. Item number 4, again, is going to be obviously the opposite effect. If you're not in the labor force and now you're looking for a job but don't have one yet, you're considered unemployed, so U is going to go up, and the overall rate, U, is going to go up. And I wrote U and U. This is really the unemployment rate over here on the left, because it's calculated based on these raw numbers that gives us a proportion or a percentage. Okay, the last 2 examples. We've got PEU. That's where you go from being employed to being unemployed. And obviously, you lose your job and now you're out of work. Unemployment rate's going to go up. That's what's happening for an awful lot of people now. And then finally, if you go from a state of unemployment and find a job, unemployment rate's going to go down. All right. No surprise there. Okay. So we mentioned the other day a lot of different definitions for unemployment. Frictional, structural, seasonal, cyclical. And frictional is the main one that we're going to talk about here. The cyclical unemployment is a function to a large extent of macroeconomic policies or external forces we can't really do anything about, okay? And that's what we're going through right now. The structural unemployment is natural outcome of evolution in technology, for example, evolution in consumer buying habits, or other factors that change what is being valued in the economy and what's not being valued in the economy. So technology makes certain fields a lot more lucrative, but then takes away from other fields where you don't have the demand for those goods and services. Seasonal doesn't require much of anything because it's predictable, tremendously driven by the seasons of the year, the weather, for example. And that leaves us with frictional unemployment. Frictional unemployment is exactly as the name implies. There's friction. There's something that's not smooth. And what's not smooth here is the flow of information between those who are looking for work and those who have jobs available. So in this situation, there is a match, but the match doesn't happen instantaneously. And therefore, to the extent frictions remain, it will take longer for people to line up with the jobs that are available. So from a policy perspective, we talked about things that would reduce frictional unemployment. The obvious example on that was going to be the internet, which makes it a lot easier to search for work than it used to be. Because how would somebody look for a job pre-internet? You go to the classified ad section in the newspaper, but that's only going to carry the local region. So what if you're looking for a job in another town? What do you have to do? Subscribe to the newspaper there? Yeah, I mean, that would be one possibility. Or you would make direct contact with potential employers, which is still a technique that you could use now. But obviously that's a lot more time consuming than simply going online, identifying jobs, click of a button, you're uploading your resume, and then you see what happens after that. Okay, so we are going to look at the job search model here to get a handle on how long people might be out of work, okay? And what are the factors that are going to make it longer, what is going to be the shorter, and some of the trade-offs that are involved in this. So in our whole discussion in chapter 14, in many ways, this is really the key analysis. A lot of the other stuff you're going to know from before. This, you're not going to know from before. Right? Okay. So this is the diagram that we have, and this is going to correspond with a diagram that is on page 568. So you think it's a throwaway in the chapter, and it's not. All right. On the horizontal axis, now we're looking at the wage rate. Before, we were always looking at wages here and employment on the horizontal axis. No, we're looking at wages here, low wage, maybe started some minimum legal wage, okay, $7.25 being the national legal minimum for most jobs, which is always superseded by the state. If the state or the locality has a higher minimum wage. And we're looking at a distribution here, so like the number of offers that would be available at various wages, okay? And what you can see here is we're looking at something that approximates a bell-shaped curve. What we're saying is, there's a few low-paying jobs, there's a few really high-paying jobs, and then a lot of jobs are going to be pretty much distributed around some sort of middle, okay? Now, how does this distribution impact a given worker? Well, there are a couple of boundary points that we can look at. One is an oldie but a goodie that we talked about when we were looking at labor supply, and that is the reservation wage. So W sub R would be the reservation wage. Any offer with a wage below that would not be accepted. So as you search and you find a bunch of jobs, but they pay too little, you just toss them aside. Those are not ones that you're interested in applying for, if in fact you know what the wage is. Or even if you don't know what the wage is specifically, you could look at certain job titles and you can do research on what those jobs pay and then decide whether that's within the range of compensation you'd be willing to accept. Remember, I'm willing to do that for you. Send me an email, give me the job, give me where you're looking for the job, and I will tell you exactly what my data shows that it pays. And it's going to be an estimate, statistical estimate, giving you the market median, entry level, and highest level of experience that matters. Okay, that's WR. On the right-hand side, the upper bound is going to be W star, K star, and K is going to represent the level of skill that's required for the job. And this would be the maximum amount of earnings that you could possibly achieve in the workforce given your skill set, okay? Because there are certain jobs that you're simply not qualified to do. That would be irrelevant. Obviously, if there's jobs that you're not qualified to do, but pay somewhere else, we're not looking at that. We're looking at the distribution of jobs that faces an individual. So it's got to be things they're interested in, what they pay, but certain things you may be interested in. You want to do economic consulting, but maybe having a bachelor's degree alone would not be enough for you to do that successfully. Okay, so that's the upper bound. So anything to the right of that is irrelevant, unattainable, too low. So now we've got the boundaries here. And then when we average out the distribution available within these boundaries and the wage associated with the amount of offers, that would give us an expected wage, E of W, which is what you believe you're going to achieve, okay? And so as you're undertaking the job search, that's kind of what you're focusing on. Okay, we'll go ahead and continue this discussion in part 3.